Good morning and welcome to another Seize the Day. Today is Wednesday, March 26th. I trust you guys are waking up, feeling refreshed and ready to begin a new day. A little overcast this morning, but it seems like it's getting warmer and warmer. So we're just banking on that one. Trust you guys are refreshed and ready to engage in another study this morning. As always, you can turn to our BethanyChurch.com page and get all the information there regarding our current series, which is all about Casket Empty. It's a way of looking at God's plan of redemption through history. It's a way of opening up the scriptures so that we get the big picture of what God is trying to communicate through his word, through his prophets, through the events that have been taking place. So as we saw, CASKET, empty, is this acronym, right? CASKET for the Old Testament, empty for the New. And we are in week one of our study on the New Testament, which is all about the acronym empty, that stands for expectations, Messiah, Pentecost, teaching, and yet to come. We took a little bit of some time to just delve into a little bit on this whole redemptive story that begins with the sense of expectations. God is setting the stage, the world stage, to preserve and protect his people. We leave Malachi with the people of God having returned into the land under the ruling nation of Persia. And so coming under Persia, they still fall under all of Persia's regulations and requirements. But Persia is gracious enough to let them go back into their land, begin to build the temple, establish themselves. But it just seems like Israel, they just don't seem to learn from their past mistakes. They, once again, they engage in the same kind of activity that their forefathers had done. They seem to hold God's word with contempt. It seems like they are once again introducing all kinds of foreign idols into their worship. God has judged them severely. But it's interesting, right? Like every generation has to learn those lessons for themselves. I mean, it's not like we're hardwired. It's not like the mistakes that we've made, we can make certain that our children don't fall into those same steps. Now, every generation has to decide for themselves who are they going to serve. And so that's what we find taking place here in Malachi. Here's another generation, and they have to learn to put God as their priority. And so this whole interaction is about that. But then Malachi comes to an end, and it's 400 years before the birth of Jesus. And so in the weeks to come, we're going to begin to take a look at what was taking place during this period of time, and how did that help to set the stage, for the preservation and protection of the people of God. And not only that, what was the expectation in the heart of Israel? What were they looking forward to? Because there were a number of things that God had said in the Old Testament that should have piqued their interest and made them recognize that there is yet more to come. So this whole idea of expectations, this is what we're going to take a look at. We talked a little bit yesterday about Messiah, beginning with his birth, beginning with his early ministry, and his death, burial, and resurrection, all of which are taking place for us in the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each one taking a unique, view at the person of Jesus and the role that he is fulfilling. And so under this heading of Messiah, we're going to take a look at what exactly Jesus has come doing and proclaiming, right? So it was this double aspect of Jesus's ministry, not just the things that he was doing, but also what he taught. When Jesus would speak, the people said, there is no one who has spoke with the authority that he has. And when Jesus acted, they would say, none of these things have been done in the nation of Israel before. And it's true. Only the Messiah could do it because he is the Son of God. Well, today I want to make a shift because the P stands for Pentecost. And Pentecost refers to that day 50 days after Passover. And Jesus was crucified, right, during the Feast of Passover. He was that Lamb of God that would take away the sins of the world. And so Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection brought Jesus back to his disciples, very much alive, and commissioning them into what this next phase of God's program was going to be about. It was going to be about them going into all the world. So what's interesting, in that Great Commission that you find in Matthew chapter 28, where it says, go into all the world, right? The word for world there, sometimes it's translated nations, but it's the word ethnos, where we get our English word, right? Ethnicities. It's about all the peoples of the world. Jesus didn't come just for the Jewish people. Jesus came for the world. Isn't that the promise that he made all the way back to Abraham? Remember when he called Abraham and he made Abraham a promise? He says, Abraham, not only am I going to make your name great, but I'm going to make you into a great nation. And he says, and I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you land. But then he also said, and you will bless all the nations through you and your descendant. You will bless all the nations of the world. So see, this wasn't only about a particular people. This is about a world redemption. This is about God, finally coming and redeeming a world that has fallen under sin and is reeling from all of its brokenness. So on this day of Pentecost, what we find is that Jesus had made them a promise. If you read in the Gospels, for instance, in John, like chapter 14, 15, 16, these are things that Jesus shared with his disciples on the eve of his crucifixion. Jesus is about to be crucified. He is going to go to the Father. And he says to his disciples, before all this happens, he says, I am going to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. If it were not so, I would have told you. But in my Father's house are many mansions, right? And so they want to know, well, where is this way? And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no man comes to the Father but by me. He says, but I will not leave you as orphans. I will send you the Comforter. And that Comforter, it says, is going to guide you into all truth. He would take my words and bring them back to your memory. The Spirit of God is the one that's going to convict of sin, of righteousness, of judgment. God is sending his very Spirit. Remember in the Old Testament, we would read about the tabernacle that was built. And Moses would go into this tent of meeting. And what would happen? That cloud would fall on that tabernacle. And it would fill that tabernacle. People would see it. And they would recognize that Moses was meeting with God. And then what do we find as the people of God were taken off into exile? You read in the book of Ezekiel that cloud that would come and rest upon Jerusalem, right? And the temple in Jerusalem. It says in Ezekiel during the time of the exile that the Spirit of the Lord departed. The Spirit of the Lord departed from the temple, and it would be crushed, and that temple would be no more. And it would take, another 70 years before the people would come back and begin to build it, but it would never, structurally, it would never, rival that of Solomon's temple. But we never read about that glory of the Lord ever inhabiting, the temple when it was rebuilt. Not like we saw both in the wilderness when the tabernacle was erected and taken down, and then finally when it was built in Jerusalem, the city that God said He would place His name. But since those days when the Spirit of the Lord departed, we never see that Spirit came back. But now, in this day of Pentecost, the Spirit of God is poured out in the sacred space that God now has taken over. And what is that sacred space? It's one's heart. God, didn't He say, I'm going to make a new covenant? I'm going to make my covenant now, and I'm going to write it on your hearts. You and I become this spiritual temple that God is building. You and I are the living stones that are being formed together. And so think about that. Now the Spirit that once dwelt in the temple of Solomon is now dwelling in us. And that Spirit now is about to provoke. It's going to be this catalyst that is going to get people moving. And why do I say that? Well, remember in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 1, Jesus says, I want you to wait here in Jerusalem, right, until this day of Pentecost, because on this day would be a fulfillment of all the prophecies that Joel made back in the Old Testament. That Spirit would be poured out on this day. But Jesus says, you will be filled with power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. So don't you see, like the Spirit then that now dwells in us was to be a Spirit that would enable us with boldness to go out into the world and bear witness to the one who has come and offered his life a sacrifice for the sins of men. That way, you and I now, we receive this calling of light in the world, right? Letting our light so shine that men may see our good work and glorify our Father in heaven. We become the salt of the earth so that we don't lose our saltiness, right? He says, you cannot compromise. You compromise, and you're going to be just like all the other generations that preceded you. But if you honor me, I will honor you. And God is promising that this new kingdom that Jesus has announced and purchased with his blood, well, now that has been set in motion. And what you read is that in the book of Pentecost, that one text in Acts 1:8, where it says, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the othermost parts of the world, that becomes an outline, basically, for the book of Acts. I don't know if you've ever thought about that before, but the whole book of Acts really begins to unfold that way. It begins where? In Jerusalem. You have the stoning of Stephen that eventually pushed the people out of Jerusalem. And where did they go? They went into Judea, and they began to preach and teach. You have the lessons of John and Peter. Then they would go further and into Samaria. You have Philip and his daughters, who were prophetesses, going out and bringing revival. Remember the story of revival happening in the cities of Samaria. Cornelius and his families coming to know Jesus and receiving the Spirit of God, just like those who were living in Jerusalem. Gentiles now coming to faith and receiving the same Spirit that the Jews had on the day of Pentecost. And then you find Paul coming to know Christ and then being the one through whom God is going to bring this word and plant his churches throughout the world. So the P in this New Testament, unfolding is all about what God is doing in this book of Acts. Let me tell you another cool little thing. I mentioned the New Testament timeline. I would highly recommend you get this. You can purchase it on Amazon. You can get it at CASKETEmpty.com. You could get the Bible study, you get the maps, but this timeline, it is so rich. One of the things that when you open this up, you come to the places that speak of Pentecost, and when you get to this place in your books, there is a really neat way, I think, that the author gives us to remember what is going to happen during this whole period of Acts. And it talks about the missionary journeys of Paul. And one of the things that David Palmer does, I think, in a way that makes it easy for us to keep the main thing. He talks about the various missionary journeys that Paul went on. And then he does this. He begins to tell you where those journeys took him and the churches that were being established. So if Pentecost now is after the resurrection of Jesus and the indwelling of the Spirit of God on his church, now we begin to see how this is moving out. And this mandate for us to go out into the world and bear witness is beginning to take place. So in the first missionary journey, there's one book. In the second missionary journey, Paul writes 2 books or establishes 2 cities. In the third missionary journey, there are 3 letters. The fourth journey that he takes on is going to find 4 cities. And then Paul will be imprisoned, and the letters to 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are then being written. So you think about the missionary journeys, you think of the cities that were first established, and if you can memorize that, it's a good way to realize how this storyline is developing in the New Testament. So, for instance, first journey was, Paul went to Galatia. So the book of Galatians will come out. That the churches that were established in Galatia will be that first one. The second missionary journey is 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Third missionary journey, you find Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Fourth missionary journey, it's about Ephesus, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. So you see, again, first journey, Galatians. Second journey, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Third journey, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Fourth journey, it's about establishing Ephesus, Philippi, Colossians, and the letter that he wrote to Philemon. Following that, the latter works of Paul are the pastoral epistles of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. 2nd Timothy being the last letter that Paul will write before his martyrdom. So you see, this is now the storyline. The storyline is all about these expectations of what was going to come. God was establishing that during the period between Malachi and Matthew. Then we have from expectations, we go into Messiah. It's all about the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all giving us a picture of the person and work of Jesus, from his birth to his resurrection to his ascension into heaven. And all of that then is now the foundation for the work that is going to be begun with the indwelling of the Spirit of God, and now motivating God's people to go out into the world and bear witness to him. And we see that people are coming to know Jesus in great number. Well, from this vantage point, then you begin to realize that as those churches are being established, we find then that in this period of Pentecost, which is about the year 35 to 65, that most of these letters are being written. So it's a much shorter period of time than when you think about the Old Testament that we just went through. But those letters then, as they were being written by Paul on those journeys, let me back up. As the churches were being established, then Paul would follow up with his communication. And that communication had everything then to do with this teaching ministry. The last book that would be written would be the book of Revelation. That was written by the Apostle John as he was in exile on the island of Patmos. But he wrote Revelation there about 95 AD. Most of these books, you find were penned somewhere in the 60s to the 90s. And so what we find in these books is that the teachings of Jesus now are beginning to be taught and shared. And so you find in the various books, themes that are coming out that are unique to them. You can find like the book of Hebrews, is a book that was written because people were beginning to lose heart. And so you find that the writer of Hebrews is writing to them to run the race, right? To not give up, don't grow weary, right? You find, in the book of Romans, the articulation of what it really means to be saved by grace through faith in the Son of God, Jesus. That whole book of Romans is God's way of just showing us something of this, grace that God shows apart from the keeping of the law. Corinthians is a book that's written addressing so many of the problems that were coming to bear in Corinth, from divisions to immorality, to an abuse of the Lord's table, to the denial of the resurrection. And so it becomes a way in which you can look at how the Apostle Paul addressed those particular issues, which, are going to recycle again, generation after generation in churches, all during the period of since Jesus came. And they begin to inform us about what it really means to live this life, with God. And so the teaching components, I'll take a little bit more time tomorrow to just talk about some of those core beliefs, but that's going to be the next big section as we look at this whole empty, category. So expectations, Messiah, right? So expectations, Messiah, Pentecost, teaching, all about the books now, right? And yet to come, all about Revelation. So this is the overarching scheme of what we will be looking at in the weeks to come. I'll take a look at a couple of the questions from our Bible study portion, Lord willing, tomorrow. But I think I gave you enough to think about today. It's a great way to begin to just in your head begin to put the big picture of how the New Testament is fashioned, so that as we begin to look at the individual pieces, we'll find ourselves really equipped for what is coming. Well, my friends, thank you so much for joining me today on this Wednesday, March 26th. Trust that you go out, seize the day, and as always, never forgetting that God is good all the time. God bless you, my friends. Hope to see you again tomorrow.